Is Dalton Risner facing stiff competition at the left guard position heading into Denver Broncos training camp? We talk about why Netani Muti could be hot on his heels. Plus, what about Lloyd Cushenberry? Does he have the center position locked down? You get that and much more in today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back here to a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, senior Broncos analyst at Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Once again, Broncos country, thank you once again for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform. Not to mention, if you're watching us on YouTube, we appreciate you all so much for taking time out of your day to listen and to watch us talk all things Denver Broncos football every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off-season. Sarah, we're getting closer to Broncos training camp here, my friend. We have a few more positions and storylines we'll be looking at that lead us up to the festivities on Tuesday at the UCL Training Center. Next week, taking a look at the Broncos offensive line on the interior. We're taking a look at left guard, center, and right guard on today's episode of the show, man. I can't wait to break it all down with you and everybody in Broncos country.
I'm excited as well. You know, this is one of those position groups where I think like for the longest time there, or at least it felt like for the longest time, maybe some actual long-term answers for the Broncos, right? You had Dalton Risner, the 2019 second round pick. Then you steal Lloyd Cushenberry in the third round of 2020. Then you draft Quinn Meinerz last year in the third round as well. And all of a sudden everybody's like, all right, we got these three spots kind of locked up, but I mean, things, the way that they've transpired on the field, just kind of leading to maybe some more question marks than actual solidified answers at this point. So I think training camp is going to be absolutely huge, but we've talked about before, and I think everybody that's listening right now wants to know, like, are the Denver Broncos going to have a solidified offensive line? Because that's been a revolving door, I suppose, for lack of a better term, over the course of the last 4 or 5 years.
I think that's really the biggest question for the offensive line unit heading into the season. I mean, we know who the left tackle is, right? We don't know realistically right now who the solidified right tackle is. We have our assumptions as to who we think will do it, but outside of that, it's really kind of wide open. I think that is a concern, but it also could be a blessing in disguise, right? Because we talk about a lot of these offensive line players from last year really being part of the Mike Munchak regime, the Chris Cooper regime under Vic Fangio. This is an entirely new coaching staff that doesn't really have any allegiance to players that maybe started last year outside of Garrett Bowles. Everything is wide open, I think, for the most part, with Butch Berry now coming in and being the main guy on the offensive line for this Broncos football team. But even outside of that, let's take a look at Dalton Risner. And I think really the storyline of training camp on the offensive line is really going to be surrounding not just right tackle, but I think primarily what is the status of Dalton Risner. He will be facing some stiff competition from a Fresno State guard and a guy who's just getting better as he's getting a little bit older, and a rising young guy as well in Netani Muti. I mean, we go back to his 2019 season in a similar style of scheme where he had a very good season for this Broncos team, but the last 2 years have left a little bit more to be desired by Dalton Risner. And, you know, his issues with Cushenberry next to him. I mean, is it issues with scheme change? We don't know that, but we might get an answer in training camp.
We might. And I think it's important to note that this decision, whatever the team ends up going with, whatever direction they end up going at left guard, it's going to be strictly about football, right? Because we know Dalton Risner is one of the best dudes on the team. Like, he's a good guy. He's great for the community. I mean, everybody remembers the story of him running up to John Elway at the Senior Bowl and introducing himself. He's a lifelong Broncos fan. So, like, he's one of us, essentially, Dalton Risner. So it would be super, super tough to see him not be in the starting lineup after the last 3 years, really kind of hoping and believing that he could become maybe a Pro Bowl or all pro caliber guard in this Denver Broncos offense. But we're going to have to see that on the field going forward. And you're right, he does have some stiff competition. Netani Muti getting some positive publicity over the course of OTAs, right? So really kind of seeing just how his brute strength and raw athleticism work in this offense, because I think a lot of people mistake the fact that Netani Muti, because he's so strong, I think they mistake that for he's not a great athlete, or he's much better off in a phone booth. But man, I've been pulling clips for the last couple years, watching him play, pulling him clips of just pulling out as a guard, getting out into space, making those kind of blocks on the move. And is he clunky? I mean, 300-pound guys are bound to be a little bit clunky, right? But Netani Muti can move for a big man. So I think definitely as far as like scheme fit, I think a lot of people were kind of concerned about that from Muti perspective. But man, he's to me, he's got all the tools and traits to be a starter in this league at the guard position.
And I feel like this training camp competition right here, the battle between these two guys, is something that needs to be talked about a little bit more. I know a lot of people project Dalton Risner to be the guy, and rightfully so. I think it would be great if he was the guy, if he could bounce back to where he was in 2019 and be that guy. But when you look at what Netani Muti does, we talk about the athleticism to be able to get out to the next level. I mean, we've seen that when he's pulled out to the next level to kick out cornerbacks, to kick out edge defenders. I mean, he does it at such a tight line. He's a clear out guy, is what we call it. And I feel like we've seen more dominance from him in a small sample size than we have from Dalton Risner really in the last 2 years. And I would like to see that change, right? Like I said, I'm rooting for Dalton Risner. I have nothing against him. Like, my job is just to cover the game of football, to cover how he's played. And you know, maybe I'm off. Maybe I don't know exactly what his responsibilities have been, or as to why there's been areas where when you watch the tape, it looks like he's struggling. We could be completely mistaken on that. But even Dalton himself has said that, hey, these last 2 years I have not played up to the standard that I hold myself to. And you love that self-accountability. But now it's crunch time with a young guy and a brand new coaching staff that really has no allegiance to say, hey, you know, Dalton, you know, we're not coming into this season thinking like, hey, you're the guy. There's competition. The best man's going to win, and that best man's going to be on the roster. And we'll see. Could that be Netani Muti? Broncos country, let us know your thoughts in the comment section down below. What would you like to see here in 2022? Would you like to see an offensive line with the left guard being Netani Muti or Dalton Risner? How do you think it's going to go? Let us know down below. But coming up here in just a moment, we're going to take a look at the center position, because this is another position of question in the eyes of many people in Broncos country. And is this the year Lloyd Cushenberry breaks out? We break that down in a little bit more coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me tell you about Built Bar, the sponsor of today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. They have some exciting new flavors coming up, like this s'mores puff or the cookie dough chunk puff. But they also have the coconut brownie chunk puff available at built.com here today. So go to built.com to see all the amazing new flavors, plus the 9 original flavors that they have constructed. And Sayre just threw a suggestion my way before we recorded the show, saying, I've been putting the puffs in the microwave for about 10 seconds. I haven't tried it. I have several puffs in my pantry. I will try that as well, and I will let you all know. But Sayre says it is clutch, so I'm relying on his word to do that. Plus, you know what? Built Bar is the healthiest protein bar that is out there on the market today. 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. So get yours today by going to built.com. And when you go to checkout, make sure you use promo code LOCK15. That'll get you 15% off your next order today at built.com. As we dive into Lloyd Cushenberry and whether or not he can break out in this big-time year for him in the 2022 NFL season in a brand new offensive scheme with a brand new quarterback under center, how might that impact things? Just want to say thank you so much, Broncos country, for making Lockdown Broncos your first listen of the day. We're available on your favorite podcast providers, also on YouTube. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage every single day all year long. We have you covered. Sayre, Lloyd Cushenberry really is kind of a wild card player in my mind coming into training camp next week. I think all eyes are going to be on him at center, and not necessarily because of the fact that, you know, he's gone through some ups and downs so far. I felt like his rookie season, we really saw a true rookie at the center position. I mean, you look at anomalies around the NFL. I mean, last year, rookie center Creed Humphrey was fantastic. You can make the argument, could have became the best center in the NFL in just his rookie season. He was very, very good for Kansas City. Lloyd Cushenberry's kind of gone through these ebbs and flows, these ups and downs, and not sure if it has to do with offensive scheme, not sure if it has to do with who's at quarterback, who's next to him at the guard positions. I mean, these are all things that are very contingent upon maybe analyzing the deeper part of his success or his failures. But I felt like last year watching him on tape, he gradually got better. And it wasn't like a perfect season for Cush, but he was much more improved. And I feel like that's a good confidence builder for him. But when we talk about just building confidence, the Broncos regime goes out and they draft another guy who can play center, who's a little bit older in a sense of being a draft pick. He's kind of a veteran rookie guy coming into this Denver Broncos team with Luke Wattenberg. And I wanted to know your thoughts, like really just how you view the center position right now, going into training camp, things you're looking for.
Well, I think definitely it's got to be at this point, we got to consider it Lloyd Cushenberry's job to lose, like, by far, right? I mean, we didn't see any, or we didn't hear anything about throughout OTAs anybody else taking reps from
No.
him. And we've also seen him, in all these videos with Russell Wilson. He's been right with there with Russell Wilson, working out, getting that snap and timing down, the chemistry down, or whatever they're doing. And I think definitely it's his job to lose. I mean, it it might be different if Graham Glasgow was healthy throughout OTAs. It might be different if they were rotating like Dalton Risner. Remember last year it was Quinn Meinerz rotating into the center position as well. But man, I feel like at this point, who's gonna come in the next couple of weeks, because that's really all the time that we have. Who's going to come in the next couple weeks and take that job from him? Or are the Broncos going to screw around and mess with the chemistry that he's getting with Russell Wilson and throw somebody else into the mix right now? I think, to me, I just don't see how you take him out of the job. Now, you want to talk about versatility among offensive linemen. I mean, Lloyd Cushenberry is a center only at this point. Like, we have no idea whether or not he could go out and play either of the guard positions if he doesn't win the starting center job. So in that regard, I think definitely, like, the pressure is on him to go out there and be the best center on the team, because you haven't proven that you can do anything else, at least in the NFL. So definitely, to me, he's the guy to beat at the center position, and not necessarily because he's just so much better. But what's interesting that you mentioned about Luke Wattenberg, obviously being kind of a veteran college player, he was at the college level for a long time and playing a lot of different positions at the college level. But what's interesting about him is that he's one of only two guys that George Payton has drafted or traded up to draft. And the other one was obviously Javonte Williams. And yeah, you could say, well, it was just a fifth round pick and whatnot. But I mean, the Broncos did trade up to get him. So they obviously wanted to have him. They wanted to make sure that they got him. I think that part of it is interesting. But otherwise, everything is kind of contingent upon who's going to be healthy. Like, if Graham Glasgow is healthy, is he a legitimate threat to start at center, or is he more of an option at the left guard position? So I think a lot of answers, we need to see a lot of different things unfold throughout camp.
I don't think that's a bad thing as well. I think the more competition you have, the merrier. But, as you mentioned too, I want to reference Lloyd Cushenberry's mindset too, because even though the Broncos have brought in some guys at the position that, have rotated with him, we talked about Quinn rotating with him last year. Lloyd's said, after this rookie season, he said, I didn't play well enough for them to be confident in me, to be secure in me. Like, he held himself more accountable than I've ever seen an offensive lineman play. And for him, he's a guy that's taken some lumps, and he's been a guy that's been under the microscope a little bit from his rookie season. But like I said, I want to build upon, and I want to see the Broncos build upon the growth that he had towards the end of last season. I felt like he was meshing really well at the end here with the Broncos offense, with the run game. I mean, we take a look at this offense. Last year, it really wasn't a great passing attack. Where was its strength? It was as a rushing offense between Javonte and Melvin Gordon. They can get back to that. But I think having another quarterback like Russell Wilson there, I do wonder, what will we see kind of carry over? What will we see different from Lloyd Cushenberry this season based on the work that he has done so far and the chemistry he's trying to get with Russell Wilson? Because that's probably more important than anything else. So it's going to be a storyline I'm going to be keeping my eye on when we go to training camp next week. The Broncos are back on the practice field in preparation for the first preseason game against the Dallas Cowboys. We're just about a month away, not even that, 3 weeks away from some preseason action here. And we're going to have you covered here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. But coming up here in just a moment, Broncos country, we're going to focus on right guard. Is Quinn Meinerz a lock for the right guard position? And what might a healthy Graham Glasgow have to say to that? Plus, there's some other players the Broncos could look at right guard if, in fact, they wanted to open things up. We dive into that coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me just tell you about something really cool that we have going on here on the Locked On NFL side of things here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Right now, our local experts on the Locked On NFL podcast are taking a look at the top 50 players that move the betting lines for their teams. Where do the Broncos rank? Do they have any players on this top 50 list? Make sure you tune in to the Locked On NFL podcast, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts or on YouTube, as they get the lines from betonline.net as to who moves the needle the most for their teams when it comes to the betting lines. You get that, the Locked On NFL podcast. As we jump into the fourth quarter action, we're going to focus on Quinn Meinerz and the expectations from entering his second season in the National Football League. Plus, we take a look at a couple of other players that could nudge themselves into the conversation about competing and starting at the right guard position on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Once again, Broncos country, thank you so much for tuning in. Make it Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Sayre, Quinn Meinerz, I tell you what, when we saw him a little bit earlier this offseason, I had a chance to go to the UCL Training Center, had a chance to see Quinn Meinerz, and he looks very, very solid. Like, he's lost 10 pounds, he's added more muscle, and it's all due to the fact that the Broncos' new offensive scheme will rely a lot on athleticism and being able to get to the second level quickly. And that's something he's really emphasized this upcoming offseason. And now, I mean, we're just about a week away from seeing him translate that into training camp, where gradually the contact will ramp up a little bit and you can get a little bit more of a tell when you start to go against your own guys in practice when you throw the pads on. Is Quinn Meinerz at this point, in your opinion, do you think he's the lock for the right guard spot? And if not, who are some names that maybe could come in and compete with him? Or does he have it locked down?
I feel like he's got it pretty well locked down. I mean, at least I'd like to allow myself to believe that, right? And I think others in Broncos country would as well, just because, like you mentioned, I mean, really, Garrett Bowles right now is the only solidified starter on the offensive line. And you could talk yourself into Lloyd Cushenberry, like we talked about in the previous segment, really being the only guy that's been out there all offseason. But I think you just want to at least know that there's another spot kind of locked in from somebody. You don't necessarily want competition at every position on your offensive line going into training camp. You don't want that unsettled sort of feeling. And so I think with Quinn Meinerz, what's fascinating about the fact that he's out there losing weight and getting in better shape is that he had one of the best workouts ever in the pre-draft process for an interior offensive lineman. I believe on the relative athletic score scale, his is like number 2 out of however many 100 or 1,000 or whatever it is. It was one of the best workouts ever. So he's a freakish athlete already. The fact that he's getting a little bit trimmed up and ready to play in a wide zone type of scheme is fascinating to me. But I think definitely you talk about size, you talk about strength, you talk about athleticism, you talk about just the instincts out there to just drive somebody into the ground. We've seen everything from Quinn Meinerz. We saw some really great stuff from him as a rookie. Yeah, did we see some learning experiences? Of course. But remember, this guy was playing at what, Division III or barely even that in college, and his 2020 season was canceled. So, I mean, really, his rookie season in the NFL is the first major football that he's played in a couple of years. And yeah, he was chopping down trees with his bare hands in between those times. But man, give the guy some credit for what he was able to do out there in his first NFL season. I think definitely a really good pick by George Paton and the front office. I love what he brings to the table. And I do think, man, if there's competition, is it really legitimate competition? And that's what I wonder at this position group, because you want long-term answers as much as anything on the offensive line, right? So is anybody that's currently behind Quinn Meinerz at that spot? We talked about Netani Muti at left guard. Could he be an option there at right guard if Dalton Risner plays well and then Muti plays so well that they're just like, we got to get both of these guys on the field? So I don't know. There's veteran options as well. You have Tom Compton out there. Again, Graham Glasgow. So where do the Broncos go here? I think for sure you want to see this position solidified by someone like Meinerz, but will it be?
Part of me feels like Tom Compton, because he had some experience not only starting at tackle for the 49ers, starting at guard for them and being a very monumental player and kind of their deep playoff run that they had. I mean, he was very solid on their offensive line. So the fact that the Broncos got him in free agency, I think, speaks to maybe the scheme transition that they're making here to the outside zone, and obviously the emphasis that they have on attacking, being able to step downfield one side and then to come back the other way. It's very complicated in nature, but once it's running, it's beautiful football to watch. Could Tom Compton maybe come in and be a little bit more acclimated to a system like this, or even like a Graham Glasgow who's coming off the injury? I mean, I think the Broncos right now, regardless, I feel you have to keep Graham Glasgow on the roster regardless. Even if he's not a starter, he's a valuable player, in my opinion. You brought him in initially a few years ago to start in free agency, and unfortunately dealt with some injuries that have impacted him. But when he's been fully healthy, he's been pretty solid for Denver at the right guard spot here. So now if he can stay healthy and he's not your starter, well, guess what? If something were to happen, you have a very solidified, good backup offensive lineman that can play center. He could also play right guard for you as well. Those are my thoughts here on the Broncos right guard spot here. But I do believe Quinn Meinerz, the leader in the clubhouse right now, going into training camp. Can he maintain that? Will be a big storyline to watch all throughout next week, as we'll be at the UCL Training Center watching Broncos training camp practice up close and personal. We have the media barbecue as well on Tuesday, the day before the players get onto the practice field. But Broncos country, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode, Locked On Broncos, and your favorite podcast provider, also on YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow with a brand new episode of the show as we ask the question, can DJ Jones help lead the Denver Broncos back to returning to a top 5 run defense in 2022? We focus on the Broncos defensive line and much more on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.